The sunny Wednesday morning started like any other at Riverside High School. The hallways buzzed with teenage chatter, lockers slammed shut, and students hurried to their first classes. For 16-year-old Maria Chen, though each step toward room 204 felt heavier than the last. Her hands clutched her AP history textbook tighter as she approached Mrs. Thompson's classroom. Maria had always been a model student. She'd earned straight A's since elementary school, joined the debate club, and helped tutor younger kids after school. Her parents had moved to America before she was born, working double shifts at their small restaurant to give her a better life. They taught her to keep her head down, work hard, and never complain. But lately, that was getting harder and harder. The moment Maria walked into class that morning, she could feel Mrs. Thompson's eyes following her. The teacher, a tall woman with graying hair always pulled into a tight bun, had been teaching at Riverside for 20 years. She carried herself with an air of authority that bordered on superiority, especially when dealing with certain students. Maria slid into her usual seat in the third row, carefully arranging her color-coded notes and freshly sharpened pencils. Her friend Lily gave her an encouraging smile from across the room. They both knew what was coming, presentation day. "Class," Mrs. Thompson announced, her voice cutting through the morning murmurs. "Today we'll continue with your presentations on the Industrial Revolution's impact on modern society." She paused, her lips curling into what seemed like a smirk. "Maria Chen, you're up first." Maria's heart pounded as she walked to the front of the room. She'd spent hours researching, making detailed slides, and practicing in front of her bathroom mirror. But none of that mattered when Mrs. Thompson was determined to find fault. She hadn't even finished her first sentence when it started. "Excuse me," Mrs. Thompson interrupted, her voice dripping with false politeness. "Could you please repeat that? I couldn't quite understand your pronunciation." She emphasized the last word, making a few students shift uncomfortably in their seats. Maria took a deep breath and started again, trying to ignore how her hands trembled slightly. She spoke clearly and confidently about factory conditions and labor laws, just as she'd practiced. But Mrs. Thompson wasn't done. "My dear," she interrupted again, this time mimicking Maria's slight accent in an exaggerated way that made a couple of students in the back row snicker. "Perhaps in your culture, they speak differently, but here we need to be clear." Her words hung in the air like poison. The classroom grew uncomfortably quiet. Even the usual class clowns stopped their whispered conversations. Maria could feel her cheeks burning as she tried to continue, but Mrs. Thompson kept interrupting, each comment more pointed than the last. By the time she finished her presentation, Maria's vision was blurry with held-back tears. She'd worked so hard on this project, staying up late, double-checking every fact, making sure each slide was perfect. But none of that mattered. In Mrs. Thompson's eyes, she would always be different, always be less than. As she walked back to her seat, she caught glimpses of her classmates' faces. Some looked away, embarrassed by what they'd witnessed. Others showed quiet sympathy. A few even looked angry, not at Maria, but at the unfairness they'd just witnessed. What made it worse was that this wasn't an isolated incident. For months, Mrs. Thompson had been making little comments, small jabs that built up over time like poison in Maria's system. The way she checked Maria's work more thoroughly than others, the snide remarks about certain students having unfair advantages, the constant corrections of Maria's already perfect English. That day marked a turning point, though Maria didn't know it yet. Sometimes the smallest moments of cruelty become the sparks that light the fires of change. As she sat there, trying to focus on the next presenter while blinking back tears, something inside her shifted. She was tired of staying quiet, tired of pretending it didn't hurt, tired of letting people like Mrs. Thompson think their behavior was acceptable. Little did anyone in that classroom know, this was just the beginning of a story that would change not just Maria's life, but the entire school system's approach to discrimination and bias. The final straw came during midterm week. The halls of Riverside High were thick with tension as students clutched their study guides and gulped down coffee from paper cups. Maria had spent weeks preparing for her AP history exam, creating detailed timelines and memorizing every important date and event. Her desk at home was covered in sticky notes, and she'd barely slept, determined to prove herself. The test room was quiet except for the scratching of pencils and occasional cough. Maria worked steadily through each question, carefully forming her essays with clear examples and solid arguments. She felt good about her answers, until Mrs. Thompson started walking between the desks, her heels clicking against the floor like a ticking clock. The teacher paused behind Maria's desk longer than necessary, hovering like a storm cloud. Maria could feel her presence, making her hand shake slightly as she wrote. Still, she kept focused, remembering her father's words about staying strong under pressure. He'd faced plenty of unfair treatment when he first opened their family restaurant, but he never let it stop him. 3 days later, Mrs. Thompson handed back the graded tests. She made a show of placing each paper face down on students' desks, commenting on some scores. "Excellent work," she'd say to one student, or "room for improvement" to another. When she reached Maria's desk, her face twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I need to see you after class," Mrs. Thompson announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. Maria's stomach dropped. She slowly turned over her test paper, expecting the worst. Instead, she saw a 98% marked in red at the top. For a moment, relief flooded through her, until she noticed the word "CME" scrawled across the front. When the bell rang, Maria approached Mrs. Thompson's desk, clutching her test paper. Other students filed out, a few giving her sympathetic glances. Lily-mouthed "text me" before disappearing through the door. "Ms. Chen," Mrs. Thompson began, her voice artificially sweet, "I find it interesting that you managed to score so high on this exam." She shuffled some papers on her desk, not meeting Maria's eyes. "Especially given your background." Maria's throat felt dry. "I studied really hard, Mrs. Thompson. I can explain every answer." "I'm sure you can," Mrs. Thompson cut her off. "Just as I'm sure you had some extra help. Perhaps from older students, or maybe some sort of online source." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. "I didn't cheat," Maria said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the tears threatening to spill. "I can prove it. I can take another test right now if you want." Mrs. Thompson's face brightened, as if this was exactly what she'd been waiting for. "What an excellent suggestion. You'll retake the test tomorrow, after school, under my direct supervision. Alone." She emphasized the last word with a cold smile. "We'll see what you can achieve without any assistance." That was the moment something inside Maria snapped. All the months of subtle jabs, the mocking, the unfair treatment. It all came crashing down. She'd done nothing wrong. Her grade was earned through late nights, hard work, and dedication. Yet here she was, being accused of cheating simply because she'd succeeded. Tears now flowing freely, Maria turned and walked out of the classroom. Her feet carried her through the empty halls, past the rows of lockers, and out into the sunny afternoon. She barely noticed where she was going until she found herself sitting on the steps behind the school gymnasium, her phone clutched in her shaking hands. For the first time, she decided to break her silence. She opened her photo gallery and began scrolling through the pictures she'd secretly taken over the past months. Screenshots of Mrs. Thompson's comments on her assignments, notes about things the teacher had said, dates and times of incidents. Her sister had suggested documenting everything, just in case, and now Maria was glad she had. With trembling fingers, she started typing a long message to her parents. They'd always taught her to keep her head down and work harder when faced with unfairness. But maybe, just maybe, it was time for a different approach. Maybe staying quiet wasn't the answer anymore. As she hit send on the message, Maria didn't realize she'd just taken the first step toward changing not just her own situation, but the lives of countless students who would come after her. Sometimes the biggest changes start with a single moment of being brave enough to say enough. That evening, the Chen family's small living room became a place of revelation. The usually peaceful dinner hour turned into an intense family meeting. Maria sat on their well-worn couch, still in her school uniform, trying to explain everything to her parents. Her mother kept bringing cups of tea nobody drank, while her father paced back and forth, his restaurant apron still tied around his waist. "I just can't take it anymore." Maria's voice cracked as she scrolled through her phone, showing them the documented incidents. Every single day, there's something new. It's like she's waiting for me to fail, and when I don't, she finds ways to make me feel like I don't belong. Her parents exchanged worried looks. They'd fled their homeland for America, dreaming of better opportunities, but they also knew the bitter taste of discrimination. "Maybe we should just let it go," her mother suggested softly, her accent thicker when she was upset. "You only have one more year with this teacher." That's when Maria's older sister Lisa, home from college for the weekend, stepped in. She'd been quietly listening from the kitchen doorway, her laptop balanced on one arm. "No," she said firmly, sitting down beside Maria. "That's exactly what they want. For us to stay quiet and take it." Lisa, who'd graduated from the same high school 3 years earlier, opened her laptop and started taking notes. "Tell me everything," she said. "Every comment, every incident, every time she made you feel less than. We're going to write it all down." As Maria began speaking, memories flooded out. The time Mrs. Thompson had loudly questioned if she really wrote her own essay because the language was too sophisticated. The day she'd been accused of using unfair advantages when she scored highest on a pop quiz. The countless times her raised hand had been ignored in class discussions. Lisa typed furiously, creating a detailed timeline. "Dates are important," she explained. "So are witnesses. Who else was in the classroom during these incidents?" Maria thought about her classmates. "Well, Lily saw most of it. And there's this guy in the front row. He actually recorded one of Mrs. Thompson's comments on his phone because he couldn't believe how she was acting." As if on cue, Maria's phone buzzed. Messages started pouring in from classmates who'd witnessed that day's incident. "I can't believe she accused you of cheating," one wrote. "We all saw how hard you studied." Another message read, "My mom's on the PTA. She needs to know about this." Their father finally stopped pacing. "But if we speak up," he said, worry lines deepening on his forehead. "What if it makes things worse? What if it affects your college applications?" Lisa shook her head. "Dad, staying quiet is what makes things worse. Remember what you always tell us about your first restaurant. How those guys tried to scare you away from opening in their neighborhood, but you stood your ground." Their father's expression shifted. He'd fought hard to build his business, to create a life here. Slowly, he nodded. "You're right. We didn't come to America to teach our daughters to accept unfairness." Over the next few hours, their living room transformed into a command center. Lisa created a detailed spreadsheet of incidents, complete with dates, times, and witness names. Their mother remembered she had copies of Maria's old assignments with Mrs. Thompson's questionable comments. Even their father contributed, recalling similar incidents he'd heard about from other parents at the restaurant. By midnight, they had more than just a list of complaints. They had evidence. Screenshots, recordings, written statements from classmates willing to speak up. Lisa helped Maria draft emails to 5 different students who'd offered to provide written statements about what they'd witnessed. "Remember," Lisa said, squeezing her sister's hand, "you're not just doing this for yourself. You're doing it for every student who comes after you, who might face the same treatment if nobody speaks up." Maria looked at the growing pile of evidence on their coffee table. For the first time in months, she felt something besides fear and frustration. She felt hope. and something else: pride. Pride in her family for standing behind her, pride in her classmates for offering support, and pride in herself for finding the courage to speak up. As their parents finally headed to bed, Lisa stayed up with Maria, putting the finishing touches on their documentation. "Tomorrow," Lisa said with determination, "we start making real change happen." Maria nodded, feeling stronger than she had in months. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was becoming an advocate. And with her family's support and her classmates' backing, she was ready to face whatever came next. Principal Edwards' office felt colder than usual that Monday morning. The walls were covered with framed certificates and student achievement awards, but they did little to warm the atmosphere. Maria sat between her parents, clutching a thick folder of evidence, while her sister Lisa stood behind them, her hand resting supportively on Maria's shoulder. "I understand your concerns," Principal Edwards said, leaning back in his leather chair. He was a man in his 50s who'd run Riverside High for the past decade. "But Mrs. Thompson has been with us for 20 years. She's one of our most experienced teachers." He picked up the folder they'd presented, barely glancing at its contents. Maria's father, still in his chef's pants because he'd left the restaurant's morning prep to be here, leaned forward. "With respect, sir, experience doesn't excuse discrimination. My daughter has proof of ongoing harassment." The principal's expression heightened slightly. "Harassment is a very serious accusation," he said, placing the folder back on his desk without opening it. "Are you sure Maria isn't being a bit sensitive? Sometimes students misinterpret constructive criticism." Maria felt her cheeks burn. She'd expected resistance, but being dismissed so quickly made her stomach churn. "I have recordings," she said quietly, pulling out her phone, "and written statements from other students." Principal Edwards held up his hand. "Recording teachers without permission is against school policy." He shuffled some papers on his desk, clearly uncomfortable. "Look, if Maria is having trouble in Mrs. Thompson's class, we can easily arrange a transfer to another AP History section." "Transfer?" Lisa spoke up from behind them, her voice sharp with disbelief. "So instead of addressing the actual problem, you want to remove the student who's being discriminated against?" The principal's face reddened slightly. "Now let's not throw around words like discrimination. Mrs. Thompson has taught hundreds of students from all backgrounds. She's never had any formal complaints." Because everyone was too afraid to speak up, Maria found her voice growing stronger. "But I have messages from former students who experienced the same treatment. They were just too scared to say anything." Her mother, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. Her accent was thick with emotion. "When we came to America, we taught our daughters to work hard and respect authority. But we also taught them to stand up for what is right." Principal Edwards sighed, glancing at his watch. "I understand you're upset, but I think we're making this into a bigger issue than it needs to be. Why don't we table this discussion for now? I'll speak with Mrs. Thompson about being more sensitive in her teaching approach." Maria felt tears pricking at her eyes, not from sadness this time, but from frustration. She pulled out her phone again, opened a video, and without warning, pressed play. Mrs. Thompson's voice filled the office, clear and unmistakable, mocking Maria's accent during class. The principal's face changed as he listened. For the first time, he looked truly uncomfortable. "Turn that off," he said quickly, but Maria kept playing it. Another clip followed. Mrs. Thompson making veiled comments about certain students having unfair advantages. "There's more," Lisa said firmly. "Much more. And if you won't address this properly, we're prepared to take it to the school board." And the local news stations are always interested in stories about discrimination in schools. The atmosphere in the office shifted. Principal Edwards straightened in his chair, finally reaching for the folder of evidence. "Let's not be hasty," he said, his tone notably different. "Why don't you leave these materials with me? I'll review them thoroughly and schedule a follow-up meeting." As they left the office, Maria felt drained, but not defeated. In the parking lot, her father put his arm around her shoulders. "You did well in there," he said proudly. "Standing up for yourself isn't easy, but it's necessary." Lisa was already on her phone, typing furiously. "Don't worry," she said. "If they think this meeting was the end of it, they're very wrong. I'm contacting some people I know from the Asian American Legal Defense Fund. They'll want to hear about this." Maria looked back at the school building, thinking about tomorrow. She'd have to face Mrs. Thompson again, knowing what had just happened. But somehow, she felt stronger. The principal's dismissive response had only strengthened her resolve. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every student who'd ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. As they drove away, her mother reached back and squeezed her hand. "Remember," she said softly, "the right path is rarely the easy one." Maria nodded, already thinking about their next steps. The battle wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. The local Asian American Legal Defense Fund office buzzed with activity when Maria and her family arrived after school. Lisa had reached out to her college friend who worked there as an intern, and within hours, they had secured a meeting with Mr. Park, a dedicated civil rights lawyer who'd been fighting discrimination cases for 15 years. The small conference room felt much warmer than Principal Edwards' office had. Mr. Park, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, spread their evidence across the table, examining each document carefully. Unlike the principal, he took time to watch every video and read every statement. "This is serious," he said, looking up from a particularly troubling email from a former student. "And you say this has been going on for months." Before Maria could answer, her phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "Hi, Maria. You don't know me, but I graduated from Riverside 3 years ago. I heard what's happening with Mrs. Thompson. She did the same thing to me. I've been feeling guilty about staying quiet all this time. If you need another statement, I'm ready to speak up." Mr. Park watched as Maria's eyes widened reading the message. "What is it?" "Another former student," she explained, showing him the text. "That's the third one today. They're all reaching out after hearing what happened." The lawyer nodded thoughtfully, pulling out a fresh legal pad. "This is exactly what we need. A pattern of behavior." He began writing rapidly. "The school district has very clear anti-discrimination policies. They're actually posted right on their website. The problem is, they're rarely enforced." Lisa, who'd taken the afternoon off from college classes to be there, was also taking notes on her laptop. "I've been doing some research," she said. "In the past 5 years, there have been similar complaints at other schools in the district. They were all quietly resolved by transferring students to different classes." Mr. Park's expression darkened. "Yes, that's their usual tactic. Sweep it under the rug, move the victim instead of addressing the problem." He turned to Maria's parents, who had been listening intently. "But this time, we have something different. We have evidence. Multiple witnesses, recordings, and most importantly, we have someone brave enough to stand up." Maria felt her face flush at the compliment, but her attention was caught by another incoming message. This one was from a current student in Mrs. Thompson's class. "Hey, you should know that Mrs. T spent today's class talking about how some students are trying to ruin her reputation. She seemed really nervous, though. A bunch of us recorded everything she said. Let me know if you want the clips." As Maria showed this message to Mr. Park, her phone kept buzzing. More messages poured in, from current students, former students, even a parent who'd had concerns about Mrs. Thompson's behavior years ago, but had been afraid to speak up. "The dam is breaking," Mr. Park said, his eyes lighting up. "Once one person stands up, others find their courage too." He turned to his computer and pulled up the school district's official policies. "Look at this. They have a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior. It's right here in black and white. They just never expected anyone to actually challenge them on it." Lisa leaned forward, pointing at another section of the policy. And here, it says all complaints must be formally investigated within 5 business days. It's been a week since the meeting with Principal Edwards, and he still hasn't done anything except review the materials. Maria's father, who had taken another morning off from the restaurant to be here, finally spoke up. So what do we do next? Mr. Park smiled, but it was a determined smile. Now, we build an ironclad case. Every person who's reaching out with similar experiences, we get their statements, properly documented. Every recording, every email, every instance of the school failing to follow their own policies, we compile it all. He turned to Maria. But remember, this won't be easy. Things might get worse before they get better. Are you ready for that? Maria thought about all the messages she'd received, all the people who'd been silenced over the years. She thought about her parents, who'd worked so hard to give her opportunities in this country. She thought about future students who might face the same discrimination if nothing changed. I'm ready, she said firmly. Whatever it takes. As they left the office that afternoon, carrying copies of legal documents and action plans, Maria felt different. She wasn't just a student fighting one teacher anymore. She was part of something bigger, a movement to make real change in a system that had ignored discrimination for too long. The local news article appeared on a quiet Tuesday morning. The headline was simple but powerful. Student alleges years of racial discrimination at prestigious high school. Within hours, the story spread like wildfire through social media, group chats, and family dinner tables across the city. Maria first saw it during breakfast when her phone started blowing up with notifications. Her hands shook as she read the article, which carefully laid out the details of her case without naming her directly. The reporter had done their homework, including quotes from former students and statistics about discrimination in schools. "Are you okay?" her mother asked, watching her daughter's face closely. Before Maria could answer, the house phone rang. It was the school district's superintendent's office requesting an emergency meeting. 2 hours later, Maria found herself in a large conference room at the district headquarters. This time, she wasn't alone. Mr. Park sat beside her family, his briefcase full of evidence on the table. Across from them sat the superintendent, 2 school board members, Principal Edwards, looking considerably less confident than before, and the district's legal team. "We take these allegations very seriously," the superintendent began, her voice carefully measured. The morning newspaper lay on the table between them like a silent accusation. "We're launching a full investigation effective immediately." Mr. Park nodded. "That's good to hear. Though it's interesting that it took a news article to prompt this response, when the family first reported these issues weeks ago." The atmosphere in the room grew tense. Principal Edwards shifted uncomfortably in his chair as one of the board members asked to see the security footage from Mrs. Thompson's classroom. Security footage? Maria whispered to Lisa. She hadn't known the classrooms had cameras. "Every classroom has them," Lisa whispered back. "They usually use them to monitor for cheating or disruptions, but they record everything." The district's tech specialist pulled up the footage on a large screen. Everyone watched in silence as scenes from the past few months played out. There was Mrs. Thompson, clearly seen mocking Maria's accent. There she was again, ignoring raised hands from certain students while calling on others repeatedly. The evidence was undeniable. "There's more," one of the board members said, looking troubled. "We've received dozens of emails since this morning. Former students, parents, even a few teachers." She paused, glancing at Principal Edwards. "Why weren't these concerns addressed before?" The principal started to speak, but a new voice interrupted. From the doorway came Mr. Rodriguez, a young science teacher Maria knew from sophomore year. "Because we were afraid," he said, stepping into the room. "Mrs. Thompson has friends in the teachers' union. Anyone who spoke against her faced subtle retaliation. Schedule changes, classroom reassignments, suddenly being passed over for leadership positions." The superintendent's face darkened. You should have come forward. Like Maria did. Mr. Rodriguez replied quietly, only to be dismissed and told to transfer classes. Several people at the table had the grace to look embarrassed. As the meeting continued, more evidence emerged. The tech team found years of email exchanges showing a pattern of bias. Other teachers began arriving, some on their prep periods, others after school, each with their own stories to share. The most powerful moment came when they played the recording from the day Mrs. Thompson had accused Maria of cheating. The camera showed Maria's perfect test paper, Mrs. Thompson's baseless accusation, and Maria's dignified response before leaving the room in tears. Enough, the superintendent finally said, raising her hand to stop the footage. She looked directly at Maria and her family. On behalf of the school district, I want to apologize. This should never have happened, and it should never have taken this long to address. The next hour was spent discussing immediate actions. Mrs. Thompson would be placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. An independent review board would be brought in to examine all complaints. New training programs would be implemented. As they left the district office that afternoon, Maria felt strangely light, as if a weight she'd carried for months had finally lifted. Outside, a small group of students had gathered, holding signs that read, "Stand against racism," and "Support Maria." She recognized faces from her class, from other grades, even from other schools. "You did it," Lisa said, squeezing her sister's shoulder. "You actually did it." Word spread through the community like a gentle but unstoppable wave. What started as one student's stand against discrimination had grown into something much bigger. The local Asian American Community Center's meeting room, usually quiet on weekday evenings, was packed wall to wall with people sharing their own stories. Maria sat near the front, listening as person after person stepped up to speak. A middle-aged woman talked about her son who dropped out of AP classes years ago because of similar treatment. A grandfather shared how his granddaughter had stopped speaking Chinese at school because a teacher made fun of her bilingual abilities. Each story added another piece to a puzzle that had been hidden for too long. "It's not just about one teacher or one school anymore," said Mrs. Lee, a respected community leader who'd organized the meeting. "This is about changing the whole system." She looked at Maria with kind eyes. Sometimes it takes one brave person to help others find their voice. Outside the community center, a group of Riverside High students had organized a peaceful demonstration. They wore white ribbons, their chosen symbol for unity and change. What amazed Maria most was the diversity of the crowd. Students from every background, grade level, and social group stood together, holding signs that read, "Education without discrimination," and "Change starts here." The local news crews had returned, but this time they weren't just covering discrimination. They were documenting the community coming together. A reporter interviewed several students who spoke about forming a new student organization called United Voices for Change. "We're not just protesting," said one student council member to the cameras. "We're proposing solutions. We want regular cultural sensitivity training for all staff. We want a better system for reporting discrimination. We want our school to reflect the values it claims to teach." The movement had spread to social media too. #RiversideForChange was trending locally, with students from other schools sharing similar experiences and offering support. Even graduates from years ago were joining the conversation, some flying in from different states to attend community meetings and speak with the school board. Maria's family restaurant had become an unofficial headquarters for the movement. Every evening, students would gather there to make plans and share ideas. Her father, who'd initially been worried about speaking up, now proudly served free drinks to the young activists while sharing his own immigration story. "When I first opened this restaurant," he told a group of students one evening, "people said I should stick to American food. They said authentic Chinese cuisine wouldn't sell here. But I believed in sharing my culture, my heritage. Now, look, people drive from other cities to eat here." He smiled at Maria. Sometimes standing your ground isn't just about you. It's about making space for others to be themselves too. The response wasn't limited to the Asian American community. Religious leaders from various faiths spoke up at town hall meetings. Business owners displayed supportive messages in their windows. Other minority groups shared their own experiences, turning individual pain into collective action. One particularly moving moment came when a group of teachers from elementary schools across the district arrived at a school board meeting. They spoke about wanting to create classrooms where every child felt valued, regardless of their background. "Our students are watching," one veteran teacher said. "They're learning not just from our lessons, but from our actions. What message do we send when we stay silent about discrimination?" The local university's education department reached out, offering to help develop new training programs for teachers. "This isn't about punishing anyone," the department head explained during a community forum. "It's about learning to create truly inclusive classrooms where every student can thrive." Maria found herself speaking at more meetings, sharing her story with growing confidence. Each time she spoke, more people came forward with their own experiences. It was both heartbreaking and empowering. Heartbreaking to learn how many had suffered in silence, but empowering to see them finding their voices. One evening, as she helped clean up after another community meeting, Maria found a note left on her chair. It was from a freshman she didn't know. "Thank you for being brave. Today, for the first time, I felt proud to speak Chinese with my friends at lunch. You showed me it's okay to be myself." The emergency school board meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening, but people started lining up outside the district office by noon. The usual meeting room couldn't handle the crowd, so they moved to the high school gymnasium. By 6 o'clock, every seat was filled, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallways. Maria sat in the front row with her family, Mr. Park beside them reviewing his notes one last time. The evidence they'd gathered filled 3 thick binders: statements from current and former students, video recordings, emails, and documentation of ignored complaints stretching back nearly a decade. "The board will now call this meeting to order," announced the chairperson, her voice echoing through the packed gym. "Tonight's agenda concerns the formal investigation into allegations of discriminatory behavior at Riverside High School." The superintendent stood first, her face serious as she addressed the crowd. "Over the past 3 weeks, our independent investigators have conducted 127 interviews. We've reviewed thousands of emails, hours of classroom footage, and numerous formal complaints that were inadequately addressed." She paused, looking directly at Principal Edwards. "What we found was not just one incident, but a systemic failure to protect our students." The room fell silent as she clicked through a PowerPoint presentation. Charts showed how certain students' grades mysteriously dropped in Mrs. Thompson's class despite high performance in other subjects. Emails revealed complaints that had been dismissed or buried. Security footage played on the big screen, showing clear examples of discriminatory behavior. But perhaps most troubling, the superintendent continued, was the culture of silence that allowed this to continue. Teachers who wanted to speak up felt they couldn't. Students who faced discrimination thought they had to accept it. Parents who raised concerns were told they were being too sensitive. Mr. Park stood next to her, presenting the legal implications. "The district's own policies were violated repeatedly," he explained. "Federal educational guidelines were ignored. Civil rights laws were broken." He looked around the room. "This isn't just about one teacher or one student anymore. This is about changing a system that failed everyone." Principal Edwards asked to speak, his usual confidence gone. "I want to apologize," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "I had opportunities to address these issues and I didn't. I was more concerned with avoiding controversy than protecting students. That was wrong." The board members listened as speaker after speaker shared their experiences. Current students, former students, parents, and teachers. Each story added weight to the case for change. Some cried as they spoke, others were angry, but all were determined to be heard. Finally, The board chairperson called for the vote. The decision was unanimous. Mrs. Thompson's employment would be terminated immediately. Principal Edwards would be reassigned to an administrative role away from student oversight. But more importantly, sweeping changes would be implemented across the district. Effective immediately, the chairperson announced, reading from a prepared statement, "We are implementing the following changes. First, a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior, with clear reporting procedures and mandatory investigations of all complaints. Second, comprehensive cultural sensitivity training for all staff members, developed in partnership with community organizations and education experts. Third, the establishment of a student-led diversity and inclusion council with real power to recommend policy changes. Fourth, regular audits of classroom practices, grading patterns, and disciplinary actions to identify potential bias. And finally, a new position of diversity and inclusion officer who will report directly to the school board." The gym erupted in applause. People hugged and cried. Years of pent-up frustration and fear were finally being replaced with hope for real change. After the meeting, as people slowly filed out of the gym, a young teacher approached Maria. "You know," she said quietly, "I've been afraid to speak up about things I've seen in my own classroom. But not anymore. You showed us all how to be brave." Maria looked around at the crowd, students, teachers, parents, community members, all talking excitedly about the changes to come. Her sister Lisa put an arm around her shoulders. "How does it feel to know you started all this?" Maria shook her head, smiling. "I didn't start it," she said. "I just spoke up. Everyone else was ready for change. They just needed to know they weren't alone." As they walked to the parking lot, Maria's father pointed to the moon rising over the school building. "Remember," he said softly, "in our culture, the moon represents renewal and change. Tonight, we saw both." 2 years had passed since that first brave moment in Mrs. Thompson's classroom. The morning of graduation dawned bright and clear, with sunshine streaming through the windows of Riverside High's auditorium. Maria stood backstage, adjusting her valedictorian medal and taking deep breaths as she reviewed her speech one last time. Through the curtain, she could see her family finding their seats. Her father had closed the restaurant for the day, the first time in 15 years, and wore his best suit. Her mother dabbed at her eyes already, while Lisa sat beside them, giving Maria a thumbs up when she peeked out. The changes at Riverside High were visible everywhere she looked. The walls now display artwork and photographs celebrating the school's diverse student body. A new student-run cultural awareness club met weekly in what used to be Mrs. Thompson's classroom. The new principal, Dr. Chen, no relation, had been chosen specifically for her track record of promoting inclusive education. And now, the current principal announced, "Our valedictorian, who not only maintained perfect academic standings, but also led our school through transformative changes that will benefit generations to come." Maria walked to the podium, her graduation robe swishing softly. Looking out at the sea of faces, she saw not just her classmates, but a community that had grown stronger together. 2 years ago, she began, her voice clear and steady. "I sat in a classroom feeling alone and afraid. Today, I stand here because I learned that speaking up for what's right is more important than staying comfortable in silence." She paused, looking at her fellow graduates. "But this isn't just my story. It's the story of every student who found their voice. Every teacher who chose to stand up for what's right. Every parent who refused to accept that's just how things are as an answer." In the audience, she spotted Mr. Rodriguez, now the head of the science department and advisor to the Diversity Council. Next to him sat Mrs. Lee from the community center, who had helped develop the new cultural sensitivity training program. Even Mr. Park was there, beaming proudly from his seat. "The changes we made here have spread beyond our walls," Maria continued. "Last month, 3 other school districts adopted our new policies. The State Education Board is using our story as a case study in preventing discrimination. But the biggest change isn't in any policy or program. It's in how we see ourselves and each other. She smiled at a group of freshmen sitting in the front row, wearing the white ribbons that had become a symbol of unity at Riverside. When I was a freshman, I tried to hide parts of myself to fit in. I saw my differences as something to be ashamed of. But now I know that our differences make us stronger. They make our community richer. They make our conversations deeper. Looking at her parents, Maria switched to Chinese for a few sentences, speaking the words her grandmother had taught her about courage and justice. Then she translated for everyone else, watching smiles spread across faces as people understood the meaning. Next fall, I'll be attending law school, she announced. I'd want to keep fighting for positive change. But more importantly, I want to help others find their voices, just as so many people helped me find mine. The applause that followed wasn't just polite graduation ceremony clapping. It was the sound of hundreds of people celebrating not just one student's achievement, but their collective journey toward a better future. After the ceremony, as families mingled on the lawn taking photos, a small girl approached Maria with her mother. "I'm starting here next year," the girl said shyly. "My mom says you made it okay for everyone to be themselves." Maria knelt down to the girl's level. "You know what? We all did that together. And now it's your turn to keep making things better." Later that evening, at the graduation party in her family's restaurant, Maria looked around at the crowded room. Students of all backgrounds chatted and laughed together. Teachers mingled with parents, discussing plans for next year's programs. On one wall hung a framed copy of the school's new mission statement, which included words like inclusive, equitable, and celebrating diversity. Her sister Lisa nudged her. "So, ready for law school?" Marita smiled, watching a group of freshmen excitedly discussing their plans for the Cultural Awareness Club next year. "Ready for whatever comes next," she said. "Because now I know that one voice can start a conversation, but it takes everyone's voice to create lasting change."